Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and it is finally time. We are here for my 2025 LCK Cup Finals overview and analysis video. It is the finals of the winter split here. This series will determine who is going to represent the LCK at the first stand tournament, the first big international tournament of the year, and I think you can make a really solid argument that whoever wins this series is going to be favorites to go on and win that tournament with how the LCK has performed internationally the past couple of years. I'm very excited to go over it. It's two very intriguing teams that have both had to overcome some negative, emotions and negative outcomes over the course of this split already to get to where they are, and I'm excited to see how they react. If you guys are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, up in the iCard is going to be every single video that we've made on the LCK so far this year. We've covered every game that's happened both in the group stage, in the play-ins, in the playoffs. All of it has been covered on this channel. If you're interested in any of that, definitely go and check that out. But today we are going to be covering the finals, and boy am I excited to do so. I hope you guys are ready because there's a lot to talk about. Let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series I will be giving a finals MVP, a player of the series, to tie everything into a nice neat little bow. Nothing left to preview, nothing left to talk about. The only thing after this is going to be the international tournament. Every team except for one will be recouping and trying to bounce back in the spring split. But I'm very excited. Let's get into it. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much. There is a lot of really great stuff to talk about in the video. So let's preview the matchup. Let's talk about the two teams. It's, of course, a finals matchup between the team coming in from the winner's side of the bracket, that being the number 5 seeded Hanwha Life Esports, and the team coming in from the lower side of the bracket, that, of course, being the number 2 seeded Gen.G. A very, very fun matchup. Of course, a rematch of summer finals from last year, but this is a very different circumstance. Neither of these teams, I think, are the same team from what they were in 2024. They are very different, not only in terms of roster construction, but in terms of how they have gotten here in the first place. When you talk about that 2024 finals, they really were the two best teams in the LCK domestically. And I think when you talk about them this year, obviously both of them facing quite a bit of peril coming into this. Hanwha Life being the number 5 seed for a reason, dropping 2 series to Gen.G and D plus Kia in the regular season, the group stage, but after that going undefeated, winning their play-in series matchup against DRX, even though they looked shaky there, winning their first round matchup against T1 in what a lot of people considered to be an upset at the time. That's a big win for them. Beating Gen.G in round number 2, a team that they're now getting a rematch with, and then really shocking the world by beating D plus Kia, giving them their first best of loss of the entire year in winners finals. They have been on an absolute tear as of late, and I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that they just have a group of players that are so good at playing best of fives. Like, that is really what Hanwha Life was built to do. You have players like Zeka, like Viper, like Zeus, who are notoriously very good in these best of 5 situations, and I really do think that that contributes a lot to why this team has been so successful, but I also think they understand their identity a lot better than other teams in the LCK. Not only do they have a really good team comp and a really good team construction for this new map, this skirmish-heavy, like, play around a lot of these, like, mid-tier objectives style map, but I think they also understand exactly how to get the most out of that style with their drafts, at least more so than a lot of the other teams. It's why they've been so successful on Blue Side. It's why Blue Side has been so essential towards this team for quite a while. I'm excited to see what happens, but the big advantage that they have right now is the fact that they played so many games. That T1 series goes 5 games. That Gen.G series goes 5 games. That DK series goes 5 games. They played 15 games in the past week or so on stage in a high-pressure environment. They are very used to going the distance in these long series. They know exactly what they're supposed to be doing in a lot of these circumstances, and I think that does give them a bit of an edge if this series goes longer. And again, you play that into the fact that Zeka is historically good in, like, game 5s, that Viper and Zeus are historically good in game 5s, and now all of a sudden you're looking at a team that I'm really sure that the longer the series goes, the more they're going to level up, and that puts pressure on Gen.G, but Gen.G is coming in with just as much momentum, in my opinion, and I think it comes from an opposite direction. This team was really, really struggling throughout basically all of this split. They had the same record as Hanwha Life in the group stage, but because they were on the winning side of the bracket, they end up moving forward. they get that bye week, they get the number 2 seed going into the playoffs, but that bye week really came back to bite them, like I warned about, because they didn't play stage games for 2 weeks. They were not actively going out there like Hanwha Life was and getting their confidence back up, showing that they could beat a lot of these top teams in high pressure situations like Hanwha Life was doing, and that led to a situation where they just were a little bit more rusty, we'll just say, than Hanwha Life in their best of 5. They dropped down to lower bracket. They barely squeak by Nongshim, who was a team that they absolutely should have demolished. And honestly, they really shouldn't have won that series against Nongshim. They kind of got 4-1 and still came out on top 3-2, just purely off of Nongshim throwing games away in the back half because they're not a particularly consistent team. But Gen.G ends up limping their way into the semifinals to take on a DK team that had been super dominant up until the point where they lost to Hanwha Life. And yeah, Gen.G absolutely obliterates them. It's not even a particularly close series. Everyone plays really well on Gen.G. It's a clean sweep. And now we're looking at a finals appearance for them. It's been such a roller coaster for a team that I expected to be the best in the LCK going into the year. I still thought that the core of Keen, Canyon, and Chovy coming back from last year was the best top side in the entire league. Ruler is somebody who I still firmly believe can be the best AD carry in the world, and I loved Duro as a prospect on Fear X. I thought that this was a really nice addition, very similar to what, they were thinking when they brought Delight in many years ago, who they are now on the other side of. But Gen.G obviously needed some time to get rolling. Ruler and Canyon in particular really underperformed, I would say, at the start of the split. Duro really struggled, but that was a little bit more expected. It was the fact that jungle and bot lane were both not particularly strong. That was definitely the concerning case for Gen.G. I think when you're looking at the positives, though, the thing that allowed them to get through is they still probably have the best player in the world in Chovy, or at least, he's still going to be up there contending for being the best player in the world. He has been absolutely essential towards this team's success so far in 2025. I don't think they're here without Chovy. They certainly don't get by Nongshim without Chovy. Like, that is without a doubt the case. He was really good in that first series against HLE, even if Zeka was also very good in that series, and obviously he destroyed Showmaker in that matchup against D plus Kia. You're going to have to hope that Chovy can step up when it matters the most. He's done that a lot in the domestic LCK finals. He's won quite a few of these LCK finals, but he's going to have to do it again because there are question marks elsewhere. I think when you're looking at positive trends, Keen was awesome in that series against DK. You need that version of Keen. He's been pretty inactive for a lot of this year. Canyon basically just mega gapped Lucid, even if he wasn't perfect. You need him to show up and be the better jungler out of these two. I think that jungle matchup matters a lot. And Ruler's got to be one of the best AD carries in the world. If Duro can survive, like Gen.G can win this series. They can be the better team, but I think HLE is going to be going in with quite a bit of confidence. And when you look at some of these matchups, they do slightly favor HLE. I think when you look at the top lane matchup, Zeus is in better form right now than Keen has been. Bot lane is mega in favor of HLE with how Ruler and Duro have been playing. The fact that it's Delight versus Duro, I've been calling Delight the best performing support in the world so far in 2025. And Duro, while he was good against DK and definitely was better than Beryl, like, he has shown that he is not the perfect player, that he's not going to be the most consistent player in the entire universe. That is a concern. And if you don't have Chovy stepping up, if Zeka, activates Game 5 Zeka or these big moment Zeka, then yeah, this is going to be a difficult series for Gen.G to win. That being said, they have the talent to do so. I think either team could end up taking this, and I wouldn't really be all that surprised. So, what actually happened in the series? Well, the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0 on blue side, which is, of course, very important. Them getting side selection for this series by coming through the winner's side of the bracket is pretty essential because we've seen blue side matter a lot, specifically for HLE, throughout this playoff run, and they came out and proved that it was worth it in game number 1. They draft a much more cohesive, a much less difficult to execute composition here in game number 1, and they're able to kind of waltz to a victory. There is simply no way that Gen.G could ever win this game if they don't have a gigantic gold lead at 20 minutes. Like, if you're 20 minutes in and the game is neutral, this is unwinnable for Gen.G in my opinion, because this team comp falls off so hard. Your idea is so direct. It's like Nidalee and Bessa for the middle of the map to try to shut down the Yone early, to try to not allow that Yone plus Sedge combo to get out of control, to not allow Camille and Kaisa to really scale up and become problems in the late game. You just need to get enough gold onto either Mbessa or Mordekaiser or somebody to be able to split a lot of this map up and force Hanwha Life to not take 5v5s in the back half, because genuinely I just don't think there's ever a way for you to win 5v5s the later this game goes if you're Gen.G, and I think HLE understood that. They played pretty safe early on, and they made sure to actively go and try and contest over, a lot of the neutral objectives that were going to be a little bit more givable for Gen.G, like, denying 4 Void Grubs or 5 Void Grubs for Gen.G on the other side, I think was pretty massive, and obviously, giving up Otacon was totally fine because they realized that they could win every fight, basically, from that point onwards, and they were correct. Now, a lot of that was Viper getting super fed and Delight being really good this game, but generally speaking, I think when you're looking at the draft and you're looking at the advantages for HLE, this comp is inevitable in comparison to Gen.G's, not only because you scale super well, which you do, again, with Camille, with Yone, with Kai'Sa. You have so many ways to win in the back half. You have so many ways to get picks in the back half to even recover from deficits in terms of, like, the enemy team having a gold lead, but because Gen.G's comp does fall off super hard because they don't really have a way to win fights in the back half of the game unless Ezreal somehow, someway gets mega fed or Mbessa is just pulling everybody away in a side lane. So, I really like the way HLE played this, but player of the game kind of has to go to Viper. I mean, the dude did an absolutely ridiculous amount of damage. I think he almost did like 40% of his team's damage in this game, something absolutely ludicrous. The Kai'Sa did get super fed, and Viper has been really excellent when he is winning. Now, the concern with Viper so far in 2025 has been that when he's not winning, when he is losing in lane, and when he's not been, ahead in terms of gold, he's actually not been particularly good. He's been a lot more feast or famine as an AD carry than maybe you would typically expect or anticipate out of Viper individually as a player, but when he wins, he crushes, and he absolutely crushed this game. The damage that was coming out on the Kai'Sa was truly exceptional. And again, like, this champion is relatively inevitable as this game continues to go along, but still, you wanted to see a good performance out of him. You needed to see this bot lane be better for Hanwha Life. I think that's going to be their biggest strength on paper going into this series, and that's exactly what happened. The bot lane was better. Part of that was Delight on the Alistar, who had a really good game. Duro really struggled to be able to keep up with the pace and the pressure that Delight was putting on, and that is the big concern for Gen.G, and the big positive for HLE is I think you're looking at this support matchup and seeing it very much in favor of Hanwha Life, and that very much played out in game number 1. If the Kai'Sa and the Alistar are going to take over, if the bot lane Viper and Delight in general are going to be able to take over these games, I think that's going to make it way more difficult for Gen.G to ever actually be able to generate anything. I thought Zeka, Zeus, and Peanut were all very good here as well. Big mid gap here. Chovy needed to be really strong on the Mbessa in the middle of the map if they were going to flex that there. He wasn't. Like, he just wasn't particularly relevant at all here in game number 1. Zeka definitely dominated on a champion he's very comfortable on, that I think both of these players really wanted to get in the Yone. And speaking of champions that I think both teams really wanted to play in this series, with it being Fearless, the Nidalee in game number 1 goes to Gen.G, and it doesn't get them any sort of success. Both of these junglers have found a ridiculous amount of success this year on Nidalee, and so to see that taken out of the equation, to see Canyon get that very early on here in the series and not be able to win on it, definitely something to keep note of. I really like Yone plus Sejuani for Hanwha Life, and that's also gone now too, but the Nidalee being out of the question I think is certainly an intriguing concept. Zeus was great on the Camille, being able to shut down that Mordekaiser counterpick. Overall, this is just a really good game from Hanwha Life, them understanding their win condition, not over-pushing their advantages, realizing that the comp is inevitable, and allowing Gen.G to, even when they are getting stuff, even when they are generating a gold lead, understanding that, hey, we still are probably going to win 5v5s in the back half of the game because they're going to have a Nidalee and an Mbessa without any gold. They're going to have a Mordekaiser who's not going to be particularly fed, and they're just not going to have the damage to be able to break through, especially if we start getting some picks, which they did. So credit to HLE for understanding the win condition and not overpressing. And then for Gen.G, I just don't like this draft. I really don't like the idea of, well, we got to win before 20 minutes or else the game is kind of over. I just don't think that that's going to be a particularly consistent way for them to be able to win games, especially because I think putting Chovy on something that is just inherently going to get outscaled is not really something that I like seeing almost in any circumstance. Chovy is dud of the game in game number 1. Don't get it wrong. Like, he played poor on the Mbessa. I'm not just blaming the champion for the way that he played. I know I can get the reputation of being a bit of a Chovy defender, but like, this was a bad game from Chovy. I do want to attribute it at least a little bit to the fact that it's really hard for Mbessa to be good later on in this game when she doesn't have resources. It is so paramount for Nidalee to play for the middle of the map here and to try to get the Mbessa into a good spot, because if those two aren't winning early, again, I just don't really see an out for this team. You need her to be able to pull some pressure off into a side lane, or for her to just be able to get onto the back line, get onto the Kai'Sa, and just try to make it a little bit more difficult for her to carry the game, even if she still has resources and options and a lot of peel on this team. Like, that's the only win condition I think Gen.G ends up having, and Chovy just was not strong at any point, and I think that really came back to bite them. Duro was awful this game on the Leona. When he gets outplayed, man, he gets outplayed hard. Like, he was by far the worst of these two supports, and the bot lane gap does look like it's going to be very much in favor of HLE, which again is probably going to win them the series if that continues over the course of the next couple of games. Like, they need to show, they being Ruler and Duro, that they can at least be neutral against Viper and Delight. I think if Gen.G want to actually come out on top here, Keen was definitely worse than Zeus. Canyon has a good scoreline, but didn't really accomplish anything on the Nidalee. Again, that pick is now gone. The pressure we've seen generated from these two teams on that champion is huge, and to not have that option I think is certainly interesting. And Ruler was fine, but like, Ezreal is just one of those champs that I don't think was in that great of a spot this game. Kai'Sa's perfect into Ezreal. Like, she does everything that you would want as an Ezreal quote-unquote counter. Like, she can survive early even if she's not going to be particularly strong, and she mega outscales him. And so I just don't really know what they were supposed to do this game once Chovy lost in the mid lane, once Canyon wasn't able to get this gigantic lead in the jungle. They are able to bring back, you know, Otacon and Baron and some of these other things, right? But they never were going to be able to win a final fight at the end of the game. The longer this game went, the harder it was going to be for them to win. And I think they found that out the hard way. But it's just game one. Don't panic. Don't freak out. You're down 1-0, but you can come back from this. You've been in bad situations before in this playoff run, and you've been able to make it work. For Hanwha Life, if you can get that 2-0 lead, things are going to get pretty dire. You know, Gen.G having to win 3 games in a row against HLE in a pivotal LCK finals series is definitely a bit of an uphill battle, we'll just say. So game 2 is pretty important for Gen.G to be able to take. Are they going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a series on our hands. It felt like both teams kind of trading hard win conditions back and forth. I know red side's more difficult to draft towards, but this is definitely a bit more of an extension than I would have expected. Gen.G drafts a comp that I think has a lot of synergy, a lot of champions that I've kind of been really pushing for in terms of the results that we have seen so far on the Rift, specifically Taliyah in the mid lane, a champion that I'm just shocked is not getting more play in the current meta with the way that the map has developed and the way that the meta in general has developed. In HLE, just without really a strong win condition, I really don't know how you're supposed to win this game. If you're Hanwha Life, you don't win 5v5s later on in the game because Gen.G have so many different engage tools. It's so difficult to, you know, stop a Vi Nautilus from just getting onto your Azir or your, you know, Ashe or something in the back of this game because they don't have perfect safety or anything like that. They have so much damage with Rumble, with, you know, Corki. They have ways to control the mid game because you've got Vi, Taliyah, who are perfect for a lot of these mid game skirmishes. I'm really just not sure how you're supposed to win this game if you're Hanwha Life, with the exception, I'll just say, of Zeus in particular getting really strong on the Cassante and making it a little bit more difficult to front to back and just kind of creating the situation where someone has to match him if he is going to be pushing, kind of try and take away those 5v5 opportunities. But that is just so much more difficult to execute on, and honestly, I don't think it's really possible to execute on that unless Gen.G, like, really screws up. This is a situation where, you know, HLE kind of has priority early because they have Xin Zhao, and, you know, they should be playing around that spike, but you're playing against a Taliyah, you're playing against a Rumble, which has done really well in lane, regardless of whether or not it's supposed to right now in terms of expectations, and you don't win in the mid game, you don't win in the late game, so I guess I just don't really understand the idea behind a lot of these picks, but we'll get into it. Let's talk about what Gen.G actually did well. First off, I think they are capitalizing on some of the champions that are underutilized in the meta right now, specifically Taliyah in the mid lane. I just don't really get why teams aren't prioritizing this champion. You want to be able to fight consistently over a lot of these new objectives in the mid game, things like Void Grubs, things like Otacon. That's where Taliyah really thrives, and pairing her up with someone like Vi just creates this situation where you can basically get any 3v3 whenever you want, wherever you want, if you want to try and accelerate the game in that way, and that makes these fights so much easier. They're so much better than the HLE comp at being able to skirmish over a lot of these objectives. And I think that is something that makes this game a lot easier to play out. If they do go later on in the 5v5s, obviously Corki bot lane, I think, is where you're going to find a lot of Corki success at the current moment. Mid lane, it's just way too slow. Like we just talked about why Taliyah was good. It's the same reason why Corki isn't as good in the mid lane, why it's been losing in the mid lane, because it can't really skirmish in that same way 3v3, but put it bot lane, allow it to scale up, put it in a lane swap, and just get him some gold. He can still take over later on, and he can be really good in the 2v2 if you get the right matchup. You don't have to lane swap Corki out of those situations. Rumble has been overperforming all year long. Like, it's been winning matchups that I wouldn't necessarily consider positive matchups for it, and this was another case where that ended up happening. I just don't think Rumble should be in a position right now where he's beating K'Sante and just generally being more useful than K'Sante. That is a big problem for HLE in terms of this draft. You need K'Sante to be strong in order for this comp to really work under any circumstance, and, you know, the Rumble was really good, and so I think you're just looking at a lot of situations where Gen.G is properly identifying underplayed champions and underplayed strategies in the meta right now and being able to take advantage of that early on before a lot of these champions are out of the way, and I think you can point to some of the players really stepping up as well. Duro's actually going to get my player of the game here for game number 2. I know I didn't really speak about the Nautilus, but Nautilus being a frontline, like, free engage target onto things like Azir and Ashe later on in this game is a big reason why this comp is so easy to execute for Gen.G, and Duro, I think, played excellently throughout this entire game, being able to land priority hooks onto priority targets, you know, just being a good frontliner for a team that kind of desperately wants to front to back later on in the game. You know, Duro was very relevant and very important, and I think you need to see him step up. Again, if he's going to be able to survive against Delight and Viper, if this bot lane's going to be able to go neutral, I think you can make the argument you are better in a lot of the other roles, that Keen could be better than Zeus, that Chovy could be better than Zeka, right? I think it's very reasonable to expect that to be something that is a possibility, so long as Duro specifically can survive on the bot side, and he did more than that here in game number 2. He was very valuable. Ruler was doing a ton of damage on the Corki. Ruler does this whenever he gets a champion he can actually take over in the mid to late game on. He's just really consistent in that phase, and we'll talk about Viper. This goes back to what I talked about, the feast or famine nature that Viper has really adopted over the course of this year. Chovy was solid on the Taliyah, just moving around the map. Canyon was really good on the Vi. Peanut wasn't really all that awful on Xin Zhao. He usually is really awful on Xin Zhao, and so, you know, I was kind of expecting this game to go awry for HLE. This has been one of his worst champions over the course of this year, but, you know, Canyon was still much better, and Keen did awesome on the Rumble. Again, that champion is just winning. He just is doing well in the meta right now, even if I'm not expecting him to, and I have to really start taking those results and those statistics into account. So credit to Gen.G, I think they played it out well, and for HLE, you just didn't really have the tools to be able to come back in this one. Viper's gonna get dud of the game for me here in the bot lane. The feast or famine nature of Viper is really gonna be something that I'm studying going forward, and, you know, kind of thinking about whether or not HLE can be a team that ends up winning Worlds if Viper's just gonna be like this in a lot of the big series, because when he loses, he is so useless, it's actually absurd. This was a really bad Ashe game from him. He just played the champion really poorly, wasn't really in good positions. I don't even really know what else to say. It just was not a game that you want to look back on and you know, think very positively of. And honestly, Viper has had way too many of those over the course of the last, like, week or so. Like, in all of these best of fives, when this team is losing their customary 2 games per series, Viper has been a big reason why those games are lost. It's been very disappointing. I think you can also look, of course, at Zeus, who was way too influential into this comp's, like, structure to be as bad as he was in this game. Like, he just needs to step up. He needs to be better on this K'Sante. Not all of this was his fault, but this is a matchup that's supposed to be in his favor. Peanut is supposed to be showing him a lot of favoritism in the early game. It just didn't happen. Zeka was fine on the Azir. That champion continues to lose despite good performances, and I think a lot of that is, again, Azir just not fitting into the meta at the current moment in the way that all of these mid laners want him to, because he's not able to skirmish as much in the mid game. Definitely not as much into something like Taliyah. Like, this is a big reason why I like Taliyah, because it punishes things like Azir so heavily if you're going to blind pick it. Peanut's never been particularly good on Xin Zhao, and even if he wasn't running it this game, he wasn't nearly as proactive as he needs to be on that champion to be able to establish the early game lead. Overall, HLE just drafted something that I don't think was ever going to be good for them, and I think that really cost them. And I think we had back-to-back games here where the easier, more varied comp, the comp that had significantly less trouble executing, ended up winning. Like, it's just, we'll just see how that ends up progressing, but turns out blue side, it's a lot easier to draft a more cohesive comp right now. Who would have thought? But it's just tied up at 1 apiece. This is a best of 3 now. We go into game number 3 tied up. The winner of this game is going to be in a phenomenal spot. If HLE can win it on blue side, they keep side control for the rest of this series. They guarantee themselves blue side for game 5 if it does end up going to that, and puts them in a really nice position. If Gen.G can win a game on red side, that blows open the entire series and creates an entirely new dynamic. So I'm excited to see where things end up going. Game 3 is mega important. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and the blue side dominance is going to continue here. This was a great game individually from them, and it does break the trend of me saying that whichever comp feels a bit more inevitable, whichever comp has more outs in the later half of the game, ends up winning. That was not the case here. This is an HLE comp that is definitely going to get outscaled the longer they wait. Zeri is just one of those champions right now that is going to be pretty inevitable if you leave her up to her own devices. Add on to the fact that you've got something like a Vayne on the top side, you've got Galio and Rakan to be able to protect those two. This becomes a very difficult game for HLE to win if it goes a long time, but credit to HLE, this was just them outplaying Gen.G, and I think they did a phenomenal job on that front. Obviously, top lane is going to be where a lot of people put a lot of their attention, but I think that there were multiple parts of the map that were expertly played by Hanwha Life that really ended up getting them a lot of advantages. Delight had a phenomenal game on the Rel. I think Viper is honestly undervalued for how well he played the Misfortune in this game, and overall, I think you can just look at multiple sections for HLE and say, you were just kind of the better team, the better group of 5 players in this game number 3, which got them across the finish line. For Gen.G, like I said, you kind of have an inevitable draft, if you will. Zeri is always going to be a problem getting online later on in the game. You have ways to keep her safe if you want to play these front-to-backs, and I think the Vayne is, in theory, a really good pick. I think Keen is usually pretty good at this champion, but oh boy, was this punished super hard by Hanwha Life. This should not have gone the way that it did if you were Gen.G, and we'll talk about that. But let's talk about HLE first and foremost. Player of the game is obviously going to go to Zeus. I don't really have to think about this one all that much. This was not a difficult decision. Zeus was incredible in this game. He just absolutely decimated Keen, and just decimated the entire game on the Aatrox. His damage numbers were genuinely out of this world. Like, this is one of the better Aatrox games that we've seen all year in 2025. This is the kind of, like, final Zeus performance that you would typically expect from a player of his caliber, and boy did he show up. This is not a great matchup for Aatrox. This is not a good game for an Aatrox in general, because Aatrox kind of needs to be able to have pressure early on, at least in my opinion, to have the same kind of effect on the game that he wants to have later on, to be this unkillable machine that can, kind of split the front and the back line, create a bit of a disparity, as I like to call it, to allow the frontliners to be a little bit taken out of position, we'll just say, allow the backliners to be a bit more exposed. Like, that's what Aatrox wants to do later on, but he kind of needs to have gold and pressure in the early game to get to that point. And Vayne should theoretically take that all away, especially with something like a Lee Sin in the jungle. There really should be no reason that Aatrox has the ability to survive throughout a majority of this game. You should be punishing this champ over and over and over again, following him around the map, whichever lane he wants to end up going to, and just kind of trying to take him out of it. Allow the MF to get strong. Who cares? You have other tools to be able to deal with her in the late game. But that didn't happen. Zeus ends up getting super fed on the Aatrox, just taking over, doing the most damage in the game, and just being a major nuisance for Gen.G. This is a player diff. Plain and simple. No other real way to categorize or analyze that. It is just ridiculous stuff from Zeus. The rest of this team, like I said, was good, though. Viper and Delight looked really solid. This is a pretty decent game for MF. You're going to have pressure, obviously, early, and if they do end up going for lane swaps, you can actually do a lot in the mid game with the comp that they end up having with things like Maokai and Ahri supplementing that. I'm not a huge fan of Misfortune in this current meta. I think that there are times where she's just not as useful as you maybe would want, but I think Viper was good here. Delight was excellent on the Rel. This guy is just ridiculous. He is so good at support. He's genuinely playing like top 1 support in the world right now. Very fun. Peanut goes deathless on Maokai. That's a good sign. Zeka goes deathless on Ahri. That is also a good sign. Gets moving around the map and actually can match the Galio roams for the most part. Overall, like, I think everybody on HLE played well. Delight in particular played great, but Zeus was the star. Like, there is nobody else you should be looking at as like player of the game, or really even the focal point for HLE. The Aatrox is the reason that this game was so easy for them to win. And then for Gen.G on the other side, like, you just gotta look and point at Keen and Canyon and just say, like, what the hell happened? Like, what even was this game? Like, Keen's dud of the game, obviously, on the Vayne. This was one of the most useless Vayne games I've ever seen, and we've seen some really bad performances on that champion in the top lane. This should be a free matchup early on for Keen, and it just didn't end up happening. Even without jungle intervention, this should not be difficult for the Vayne to be able to deal with, especially with jungle intervention. This should not be difficult for the Vayne to deal with, and I think you outscale this Hanwha Life team if you do get to the part of the game where it's, Vayne and Zeri trying to outdamage a Misfortune. Yeah, I think that's probably going to happen later on in the game, but you threw away the early game so hard. You lost all of the skirmishes you needed to win in the mid game. The Lee Sin had basically no pressure on the map, and top lane was obviously just inting. Like, there's no other way to say it, and you end up losing the game because of it. You just were worse, and I don't blame everybody, but I do blame Keen, and I do blame Canyon. I think both of them had pretty poor games, and I continue to be a little bit disappointed with the results that both of them are putting out in 2025. I think everybody else was fine. Chovy was fine, even if he wasn't particularly consequential. Ruler and Duro weren't the problem, even if Viper and Delight were really good on the other side of the map. Perhaps Ruler needed to be a bit safer in this game on the Zeri, but, like, I'm not blaming him. This was a top-side gap. There is genuinely nothing else to analyze. Zeus was better than Keen in this game, and HLE was better at playing around topside than Gen.G was, and that's why they're able to walk out of this with a Game 3 win. That now puts a ton of pressure on Gen.G. They have to come out and win Game 4 to survive. 5. HLE is one game away from walking out of here, not only as LCK champions, back-to-back LCK champions, I should say, but also qualifying, of course, to represent the LCK at first stand. Big game number 4. Can Gen.G survive and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or is HLE going to be able to finally end a series before it goes the distance? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie up the series at 2 apiece. And once again, how could we go to anything other than a deciding game number 5? This is just how things go for Hanwha Life in their playoff run. 4 best of 5s, 4 game number 5s. We'll see if they can, keep the streak going and win that 4th game number 5 in a row. But Gen.G keeps themselves alive with a really interesting draft here. A very, very interesting decision. Chovy is really pulling everything out of his bag in this series, isn't he? He's thrown a lot at the wall. He pulls out the Mbessa mid in game number 1. That's not all that weird. It's definitely playable, but he pulls out the Viego mid here in game number 4. I think this really worked. Like, this ties everything together for the Gen.G comp and really gives them a ton of, closure to this draft that I think they desperately needed. It also gives them something they can actually do in the mid game, which is play for Viego, which they kind of desperately needed. This team scales really well. They are going to get to a point where Karthus is doing a ton of damage, where Varus is the strongest champion in the game, where Sion's really difficult to kill. Even Viego obviously is going to scale up and get there, but it can be a little bit of a challenge to get to that position, especially looking at this draft, looking at the fact that HLE has a Zyra, which is just going to completely out-jungle Karthus in the early game. You've got things like Sylas and Pantheon that you can play around in terms of these skirmishes. HLE have a ton of ways to punish this draft from Gen.G, and I think the Viego actually makes that way more difficult in the mid lane. So credit to Chovy, but he's not even getting player of the game, although I think you could make a really strong argument he should. He topped the damage charts. He was really influential. The champion itself did a lot. If you wanted to give it to Chovy, I think that that's fair. But I want to give it to one of the 2 bot lane members, either Ruler or Duro once again, but I'm going to give it to Duro. 2 game wins, 2 player of the games for Duro. If they lose this series, you can't blame him, or at least you can't single-handedly blame him if they end up losing this, because I do think he has been really good in their wins. He was a huge playmaker on the Bard in this one. It does feel like he's finally starting to get comfortable playing with a lot of these high-tier players like Ruler and Chovy and Canyon and Keen, right? These worlds-winning caliber players. I think Duro is starting to find his lane, and genuinely, I think that he is actually starting to play up to the potential that we thought we were going to see out of him in the beginning of this year. It always takes some time, I think, to get used to the level, but he's been really, really solid. I think Delight has been awesome on the other side, even if he wasn't in this game on the Pantheon, but Duro is matching him at the very least in terms of their wins. So I just want to give him a big shout out, because I think people are going to naturally look at this Gen.G team and see him as a weak link, and he has been at times this year, but he really has not been in the finals when it's mattered the most, which is a really good sign. Ruler was also really good this game on the Varus. This champion continues to be very, very strong. He can just do basically whatever you want. He's just so versatile in terms of how he wants to end up playing the game, and while the Jhin is going to be relatively useful this game for Viper, I think Ruler is always going to be more relevant as the game goes on longer. He's going to do a ridiculous amount of damage as we continue to move along, and if he's going to be your backline, almost like Poke Mage in this game, then yeah, it's going to be a bit of a problem to have to deal with that, plus Karthus ultimate, plus Bard and Sion trying to get on the backline, and Viego getting his resets. It just becomes a big difficulty to deal with the later this game goes, and he was obviously really good in the early game as well. I don't want to undersell Chovy. If you wanted to give him player of the game, you absolutely could here on the Viego. This was an excellent game number 4, and he continues to really be important for this team moving forward. Canyon was really good on the Karthus. We're going to talk about the Zyra on the other side when we talk about Hanwha Life, but had a pretty easy time going into the Zyra, regardless of how much damage Peanut was able to do throughout this game, because Peanut is just not successful on this champion. You can point to a lot of different reasons, but that just ends up being the case, and top lane was not even remotely close in terms of relevance. Keen not even activating the Sion passive in order to be relevant in this game. Just a really nice one from Gen.G, understanding that, the Viego kind of really does tie everything together for this draft and create a situation where it becomes a lot more difficult for HLE to move forward. For Hanwha Life, I think they fell into the trap a little bit. They get baited by Zyra still being up in this draft. A lot of times you would see that taken away, and you would see it taken on B1 in particular by a team like Gen.G. Canyon is very good at a champion like Zyra. He feels very comfortable on it, but at least my headcanon is that they understood that Peanut cannot win on this champion, that he just fails to be able to succeed on both this and the Xin Zhao. That's been the case throughout this entire playoff run for this HLE team, and they left it up on purpose to make Peanut pick it and have HLE lose this game number 4, and it ends up, being the case. It's just kind of funny how that ends up working out. I don't even think this was his worst Zyra game. He actually did quite a bit throughout this, but it's just kind of funny how that's been a bit of a trend. I think you can point to a couple of players playing playing fine. Viper had an okay game. I think Zeka was all right on the Sylas, but Zeus was entirely useless on the top side. On the Gnar, this champion just never really got rolling. Gnar has been really useless in the LCK playoffs. I think the champion has a lot of value, but we've not necessarily seen it in terms of on the Rift stuff. Top lane has been very defined, I'll just say, in terms of the champions that are succeeding versus the champions that are not succeeding at this level. And then I think Delight also had some problems on the Pantheon. I'm not blaming him entirely. This is a tough Pantheon game if things do not go your way early, but you're looking at HLE's draft and you're like, you have to control the game. The keys are in your hands. I do think you have the ability to just kind of control the entire pace of this if you are able to exert that like early dominance through Zyra and specifically play through like bot lane, play through this Jhin and try to get the Pantheon like really active on the map and you try to play for these mid-game skirmishes with Pantheon potentially being the most influential champion in the game at that point, plus the Zyra, then I do think you have the opportunity to just be up 3k gold and just win every fight basically from that point onwards, but it didn't really happen that way. They didn't have a huge gold lead. They didn't really have a gold lead at all going into the later section of the game where I think Gen.G just has way more options. So unfortunately, it just kind of is the case for HLE. It's not really a game that I can analyze super heavily, but it's game 5 time. It is time for Silver Scrapes. It is the 4th straight game number 5 for HLE. They've been so successful at being able to win these over the course of this playoff run, including one over Gen.G already. Are they going to be able to exert their dominance and show the world that they are the best game 5 team of all time, like in the world, like whatever you want to say? Or is Gen.G going to shut down the trend, going to finally slay the beast in game number 5, overcome all of their demons, and walk away as champions? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take yet another game number 5. They are going to take this series, and they are your 2025 LCK Cup champions. After everything that they went through in the group stage, losing 2 series against the 2 top teams, not even really looking all that dominant in their wins, barely getting by a DRX team and looking kind of shaky in that, to going up against a team like T1 that everyone had favorited against them and beating them, to going up against Gen.G who everyone had favorited against them and beating them, to going up against DK who everyone had favorited against them and beating them, to finally taking down a Gen.G team in the finals here. Genuinely unbelievable stuff from Hanwha Life. They have more than earned their back-to-back trophy here in winter, and we should be speaking about this team as maybe the most resilient in the world. They have probably gotten even better in these big moments, subbing out Doran for Zeus, and that is a gigantic thing to say because they were already really good with Doran. Doran was already really good domestically in the LCK playoffs, but Zeus brings a completely different level to this team when he is on, when he is working, and he was incredible in this game and in this series. For Gen.G, you invest really, really heavily into just hoping and praying that you can get to your late game, that you can play around Aurelion Sol and Jinx, and you can try to get that Ornn frontline going, and it just doesn't end up working out. You don't get to the part of the game where you can actively capitalize on that, and a lot of that is just poor play. Like, I hate to say it, like, you got outplayed. You were the worst of these 2 teams. I think a lot of times I can sit here and point to drafts, point to a couple of different reasons, give some optimistic points of views. Hanwha Life was better than Gen.G in this series. There's really not a lot of other ways to talk about it. They were the better of these 2 teams mechanically. They were the better of these 2 teams in terms of execution, and they came out on top because of it. And so, you know, unfortunately for Gen.G, that just is the case, but credit to Hanwha Life. This team is unstoppable in game number 5, so let's talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series pretty much has to go to Zeus. When you're looking at these 2 drafts, I'm going to be totally real with you guys. I don't like Hanwha Life's draft at all. I think it puts you in a really precarious position where you do really need to win early. Like, you have to be able to, I guess, survive this cavalcade of problems that you're going to run into. There is no mid-game skirmishing potential with HLE. The moment you draft Caitlyn Karma as your bot lane duo, the moment you throw away really any ability to skirmish over a lot of these mid-game objectives, and I just don't really like that in this current meta. You're setting yourself up to be in a position where you either have to win your lanes and just get this gigantic gold lead, or you have to win late against a team that scales better than you do, and I just don't really like that idea. Not that I love Gen.G's draft. I don't really like indexing super heavily into late game pressure, but I do like a couple of the picks that I think round off this draft well. I really like the 3-man combo at the start of this draft, the Jinx, the Lulu, and the Ornn. I think that first phase of the draft was actually really positive for Gen.G, and I think it gave them a core that they could really work around. The Trundle and the Aurelion Sol, I think, is where this draft goes a bit off the rails for me and starts to lose some of its momentum, but, you know, we'll talk about that when we get a little bit more to Gen.G. That had more to do with execution on these individual players than it did on the drafts, but I want to make it clear, HLE did not, like, destroy this game in draft. I don't think they walked out of this with, like, a free win. Like, again, you don't really have any way to contest at, like, 18 minutes against this Gen.G team who is going to scale harder than you, which is not not a great place to be, but what is a great thing to have is Zeus in the top lane, who is just better than Keen. Like, oh my god, this was a top gap. There is like genuinely no other way to say it. Game 3 was a top gap, Game 5 was a top gap, and it was in favor of Zeus. He's getting player of the game, he's getting player of the series. He was excellent here on the Gwen. He was up like 60 CS, like something ridiculous in this game. Just the sheer domination that the Gwen was able to show. I don't often love this idea that Gwen is supposed to, like, destroy tanks in lane. I just don't often think it plays out that way. I think it's very difficult for Gwen to punish in that way unless you are, like, way better as a player. But Zeus was way better as a player in this series. And we'll talk about Keen. He just was awful throughout, like, the important parts of this series. And it kind of takes away a lot of the excitement I felt after he was so good in the semifinals, because he was kind of irrelevant throughout the rest of the split for them. But Zeus was awesome, and he more than deserves finals MVP. In my opinion, we saw a pretty big gap in the jungle. Peanut was way more useful than Canyon in this pivotal game. A lot of that was Canyon just being completely non-existent on the Trundle, playing super scared and super passive, which is not ideal, but you gotta give Peanut credit as well. Viper and Delight did way better in this game than I thought they were going to. I did not like the Caitlyn Karma bot lane pick here. I do not think it fits into what not only this team wants to do, but just generally what you should be going for in a game number 5. Luckily for them, it does end up working out. Delight is just really good, and Karma was really useful in this game, but I didn't love the bot lane duo. Zeka was, on this Victor, and I think this is a good game for Victor to be able to pop off and take over if they are going to win late. Oftentimes you would expect that to be through the Victor, but he didn't even have to do all that much in this game. It was Zeus and it was Peanut and it was Delight that were really taking things over and really dominating. Just credit to HLE. This team just steps up when they need to. It's everybody. Like, the fact that it wasn't Zeka that needed to primary carry this game, or it wasn't even really Viper that needed to primary carry this game. The fact that you can rely on you have those two who are going to be good in big moments, and you can rely on other people like Zeus and like Peanut and like Delight in these big moments. It's just ridiculous. It's unfair. HLE looked like one of the best teams, if not the best team in the world, and I think they proved that here. And then for Gen.G, like, again, I think you just went really risky with this super scaling draft. You draft Aurelion Sol, Jinx, and Ornn and Lulu, and you're just like, God, I hope we can get to these late game fights. I hope we can get to the part of the game where our champions can scale up and be useful. And they kind of did. Like, they kind of got there. They just gave over a little bit too much to get there, and I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that their top 2 players, like the players on the upper side of the map, they just weren't good enough. Keen got mega outplayed in this game. He's going to get done of the game. He got mega outplayed throughout this entire series. He just was worse than Zeus, and there's really no other way to quantify that. That is disappointing considering Keen was better than Zeus for basically all of last year. Just not a great outcome, and certainly not what you wanted to see here. Canyon was a non-factor, and I'm worried about Canyon, man. Like, this guy really is becoming a bit too one-dimensional for my taste. Like, that one dimension is so freaking good, and he still performs like one of the best players in the world when he does have that one dimension, but when he's taken off of that, like, picking Trundle here, like, dude did literally nothing in this game. He watched as his team crumbled and disintegrated and lost. Like, Chovy, Ruler, Duro, like, you can see by their scorelines, they weren't particularly influential on this game as a whole. They were scared to make too big of a play, too big of an impact, but they were losing. They were bleeding out in this game, and the longer it went, the more inactive they were, the longer they threw away their advantage of being, like, inevitable in the back half of this game and, winning these 5v5s, because the Gwen and the Victor and even the Caitlyn are still going to be useful as this game goes along if you give them a free gold lead, which is exactly what happened. So for Gen.G, I think there are a lot of things they need to clean up. I think that I'm not even really pointing in the direction that a lot of other people are. I think Ruler and Duro have figured out how to play 2v2 as a bot lane and have started to get a lot more chemistry than what they had at the beginning of the split. I definitely think they're in a better spot now than they were like 2 weeks ago, but Canyon's gotta be better. Canyon was a letdown and a reason why this team couldn't be champions, and that's not good. Keen let this team down and wasn't good enough. He's a reason why this team isn't a champion, which is not good. Like, you just have to get better in these areas. There's nothing else to say. Like, these are the things you need to fix going into spring. But again, congratulations to Hanwha Life. They have more than earned their success here. They have been tested over and over again, thrown through the fire, forced to play 20 games over the course of the last couple of weeks, and they've come out on top as your LCK champions. There might not be a more well-practiced and ready team in the world right now to take on anybody than HLE, and I think that makes them the biggest threat going into this international tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Cup Finals overview and analysis video. Congratulations once again to Hanwha Life Esports for getting their back-to-back trophy, this organization that had been working so hard for so long to put together a title-winning team, finally was able to do it last year, and they're able to follow up on it by winning the Winter Split the next year as well. This is not a flash-in-the-pan team, and like I said at the end of that preview, I do think this is the team that, they're the team to beat in the world right now. They have played played by far more games than anybody else. They are more practiced on this patch and on this map on stage than anybody else, and I think they have to be considered pretty major favorites going in to the first stand tournament, not only because of all of that, but because of how successful the LCK has individually been. So I'm excited to see what this team can do. I think there's a real shot we're walking out of first stand with Hanwha Life having won a big international tournament, and at that point, we have a whole new discussion about the LCK in general. So, you know, very excited to see what ends up happening, but I hope you guys enjoyed the LCK Cup coverage. I hope you enjoyed the LCK Winter Split coverage, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Of course, while the LCK Cup might be over, first stand is right around the corner. We'll be covering every game at that tournament, and we cover all of the other major regions as well, LTA, LEC, and the LPL. All of them are within their playoffs right now, or, you know, wrapping up their playoffs, and we'll be covering every single game from those regions in the same way. So if you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all